So it says there that there's a man named, there are two brothers, and one is named Shimon, and the other is named Andrea.
Mm-hmm.
And then it says Shimon is also, who is called Simon, who is called Peter, or
Mm-hmm.
Pietros, which is very strange. So in the Hebrew version of Matthew, this character Shimon or Simon has three different names.
Mm-hmm.
He's got the Hebrew name Shimon. He's got the Greek name Simon, but it's really the Greek form of the Hebrew name.
Mm-hmm.
And then he's got a Greek name. Now, what do I mean it's the Greek form of the Hebrew name? So my name is Nehemiah, but when I talk to people here in Texas, they can't say ch, so they pronounce it Nehemiah. And so the English form, the anglicized form of Nehemiah is Nehemiah. The Grecicized or Hellenized form of Shimon
Mm-hmm.
is Simon.
Mm-hmm.
So why would Hebrew Matthew give that form of the name? That's really the question I want to ask. And to answer that, we have to look at the ossuaries that were discovered in archaeological excavations in the land of Israel. There are hundreds, maybe thousands of these ossuaries. An ossuary is a bone box.
Mm-hmm.
Now let's back up. When we bury somebody today, you put them in well, I guess it depends what your heritage is. Some people will embalm the body. In the Jewish world, when you bury somebody in Israel, you wrap them in a shroud, and you put that shroud directly into the ground, and then you cover that with stones and cement. It's actually what you do, and then with dirt. In the ancient world, what they would do in Israel, in the Second Temple period, is they would take a body and they would put it in a cave. And then they would seal the cave, and they'd come back a year later.
Mm-hmm.
And then we're told in the writings of the early rabbis, blessed is the man who collects the bones of his father.
Mm-hmm.
And what that meant is it was considered a righteous deed to crawl through the tiny little opening of the cave. I mean, I would have to like squeeze through. These are very small openings. You get into the cave, and then it opens up in the cave, and you can stand up, and you see the body was lying on this stone slab. But now all the flesh is gone. It takes about a year in Israel for all the flesh to be gone. And then all you have left is bones, and you collect the bones and you put them in a box.
Yes.
And that's called a second burial. And the box where you put them in is called an ossuary.
Mm-hmm.
If it's a full-size box, meaning the length of the body, that's called a sarcophagus.
Mm-hmm.
But the small little one, essentially it's the length of the longest bone.
Mm-hmm.
Right? So if your longest bone, I think, is maybe your femur, that's the length of the ossuary. And you put the bones in there, all the bones, and then what they would do is they would take a nail that they would bring with them, or they'd find it on the ground there, from previous time, or they'd bring it with them into the burial cave, and by lamplight they would scratch in the name of the person whose bones they just stuck into the box.
Mm-hmm.
And sometimes 2 or 3 people were put in the same box. And from these names that have been scratched into the box, we learn all kinds of different things, all kinds of important things about the languages spoken in the culture of the first century Israel.
Question.
So one of the, yes.
Might I ask a question? This is not a diversion, but I want to ask a question. You said it takes about a year for the flesh to decompose. Present day Israel, there's also something that happens about a year from the time that a person is buried. For example, if I remember right, with you, with your father, for example, there was a year later. Now, I'm not saying there's a connection between it, but is there?
There's definitely no question. There's a connection.
Okay, so
in other words, the family comes in ancient times. The family would come together, and someone who was brave enough, and maybe the firstborn son, would crawl into the cave, and he'd collect the bones. And you could imagine what the smell was like. It's a closed, sealed cave where flesh has been decomposing over a year, which is why we hear about how people would bring spices, right? They would bring perfumes. To this day, they do that. They bring perfumes, or meaning at the actual first burial, and there's no second burial today, right? So when they actually do the burial today in Israel, there's a tradition that some people have. They'll take a bottle of perfume, of commercially bought perfume, right? Like Chanel No. 5 or something, and they'll throw it down into the grave, and it smashes and covers any smells that might come out, right? Now we bury, like I said, with cement on top of, to keep animals out. So I don't know that you'd smell a whole lot. But back in the old days, you crawl into the cave after a year and you collect the bones. And so today they have a ceremony, which is usually in English called the unveiling ceremony.
Okay.
And I told somebody recently I was going to Minneapolis for my grandmother's unveiling ceremony. And the response was, what's an unveiling ceremony? I thought everybody did it. Apparently it's a Jewish ceremony that after 1 year, you go to the grave and you present the tombstone, right? That's the modern version of collecting the bones and putting them in the box.
There it is. Thank you.
So now they put the bones in the box. They wrote the guy's name on the box with a nail usually, right? It wasn't professionally chiseled in. They're doing it by candlelight. It's very difficult to read. So on display at the Israel Museum in Jerusalem is an ossuary, one of hundreds or thousands, and it has written in Hebrew characters, but the language is Aramaic, but the name it writes is Greek. And the name of the person there on the ossuary at the Israel Museum, it says Simon Baneh Haichala, which is Simon, the builder of the sanctuary. So it says in Aramaic, Baneh Haichala, he's the builder of the sanctuary, meaning he's somebody who worked on the building of the temple. And so somebody who actually worked on the reconstruction of the temple, the renovations that were begun by Herod but continued after that, there was a guy named Simon or Shimon. So why doesn't it say his name was Shimon? Because people called him Simon. And you might say, well, wait a minute, how could that be? We have a perfectly good Hebrew name here, which is Shimon. Why would they write in Hebrew characters in an Aramaic sentence, Simon? And the answer is that the three languages, Hebrew, Greek, and Aramaic, were used by many people interchangeably. In fact, according to, there's this wonderful collection, book by a man named Rahmani. And for most people, it'd be a very boring book, but to me, this is one of the most fascinating books ever written. It's called A Catalog of Jewish Ossuaries and the Collections of the State of Israel. And Rahmani lists all his 461 pages of all these different ossuaries and what it says on the ossuary. And one of the things he points out in this book is that the ossuary inscriptions, where they would take a nail and scratch the name of the person, proves that even the poor people in Israel, or in Jerusalem at least, had some working knowledge of Greek. He says they probably didn't know grammar, and they maybe couldn't speak Greek, but they knew enough Greek where they could write the person's name on the ossuary. And then sometimes they used Greek forms of names. And you say, why would they use a Greek form of a name if they're speaking Hebrew or if they're speaking Aramaic? And the answer is that the Greek culture is the dominant culture. There was a famous Israeli politician back in the 1990s, and his name was Tommy Lapid. And you say, Tommy, what kind of name is Tommy? Well, Tommy's an English name. So he was actually born in Yugoslavia, which today is, I believe, Serbia. He fled from there after the Holocaust or during the Holocaust, arrived in Israel, and his real name was Yosef or Yossi, but he was called Tommy. Now, why was he called Tommy? Because English is the dominant culture today throughout the world. That's just the way it is, right? You go to China, where I lived for a year, and everyone has an English nickname, right? They don't have a Swahili nickname. Why is that? Because English is the dominant culture throughout the world. So people in the First Temple period had Greek nicknames, or they even had the Greek form of their Hebrew name was used. So here we have at the Israel Museum, his name is Shimon Boneh HaHeichal. He's known as Simon, Shimon, the builder of the sanctuary. However, on the ossuary, his son or some relative of his takes a nail and scratches in Simon Baneh Haichala, Simon, the builder of the sanctuary, and he spells sanctuary incorrectly in Aramaic with a hey instead of an aleph, because maybe his grammar wasn't so great in Aramaic either. So we've got all these different cultures: the Hebrew, the Aramaic, and the Greek. And the conclusion that this scholar Rahmani has is that people spoke different languages, and specifically Greek. Let me read you what he writes about the Greek. So he has a section on page 13 of the book called Language, and he talks about how there's bilingual inscriptions. There are inscriptions where the name is written in both Hebrew and in Greek. Sometimes it's written in Hebrew in another language, but usually it's Hebrew and Greek. And then he concludes, from these inscriptions it can be concluded that in and around Jerusalem and Jericho, even the lower classes of the Jewish population knew some Greek. This knowledge was probably limited to everyday speech, and in general did not include a profound familiarity with the language, its grammar, or its literature. And then he says there's a similar thing at Beit Sharim in northern Israel from a later period. So in other words, people could kind of get by in Greek. They could speak some basic Greek, but they weren't, fluent necessarily in reading and writing Greek. And so you have this mix of cultures throughout the Mishnah, which is written in Hebrew. You have Aramaic words and you have Greek words. So this is exactly what we'd expect, that in the Second Temple period, you have a man who when they call him to the Torah, they call him Shimon. And when some of his friends see him on the street, they call him Simon. Other friends call him Pietros or Petros, Peter. And he's known by all three of those names. That's a possibility. And we have him called Kepha, not in this passage, but in other passages in the New Testament, he's called Kepha, which is an Aramaic translation of Petrus, of stone.